editor Cheryl Klein, and author Cheryl B. Klein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
I am so thrilled to chat with you. I've been looking forward to this for a month and a half. I've just been, oh my God, I have so many questions. I hope I wrote them all down. I hope I don't forget. So probably the best place to start is I never summarize anyone else's book or anyone else's biography because I'll make a mess of both. So if you would tell an esteemed audience kind of an overview of your background, although no one in my crowd, they probably have some idea of who you are already.
I have been in this business 20 years now, surprisingly enough. My current position is I'm the editorial director of Levine Books, which is a small independent press devoted to work by and about people of color and other underrepresented groups. Before that, I've been there for about 3.5 years, and before that, I spent 16 years as an editorial assistant. I spent 16 years as an editor at Arthur A. Levine Books, Scholastic, where I started as an editorial assistant, got all of my editorial education, and rose to being executive editor there. And at both places, I've done a pretty nice mix of novels and picture books, with a real focus on people from underrepresented groups and on good literary quality of various kinds, is what I would say. Like both of the publishers I've worked for have been very interested in like telling stories with depth and heart and reality, portraying the reality of other people's lives. And that's all the things that I'm interested in as a reader and as an editor as well. So it's been a very happy career all around.
Do you foresee yourself editing to the end of your career, or do you at some point have aspirations to go become a movie star? Or
editing is my vocation, is what I would say. Is like, yes, I see myself editing for as long as the publishing industry will have me, basically, and because it's a great job where you get to read things and think about them in depth and talk about them with really interesting people, and then shape them in a way that you are going to, in future, shape the way people think and talk about things. Like you're putting out the books that will hopefully change readers' minds about how they feel about something, whether it's a nonfiction subject or another person who they may not have met, or might be creating more empathy, because they think, oh, that's that sort of situation, something like that. So it's a very satisfying job, and one that I really love, and I see myself doing it as long as I can. Yeah.
Although, if Steven Spielberg is watching and he sees you and he says that you've got to come be in, we'll see what happens. No, I think the world needs you right where you are. More empathy is desperately needed.
Yeah.
Lots of questions for you. Let's, if you don't mind, maybe start a little bit at the beginning, and we'll build up. But I promise, esteemed audience, we will not finish this interview without at least talking once about flying saucers and Harry Potter. That's my personal pledge. But let's start, because you were raised in a peculiar Missouri. Is that right?
That is correct. Well, the sound motto is "Where the odds are with you." It's about half an hour south of Kansas City. So whenever I describe where I'm from, I usually say I'm from Kansas City. And I'm the daughter of 2 school teachers and the granddaughter, this is the most relevant part, of a children's literature professor. My grandfather, Philip Sadler, taught children's literature at the University of Central, what's now the University of Central Missouri. And mostly what he did was teach teachers how to use children's books in their classrooms, and then when they were teaching reading. So, but he also founded one of the nation's first children's literature festivals. So every spring he would invite like 20 to 40 authors to come to this small town, Warrensburg, Missouri, in central Missouri, and they would meet with hundreds, if not thousands, of school kids from around the area who would be bussed in to hear the authors speak. And as far as I know, this is one of the first children's literature festivals ever founded in the United States. He started doing it back in, I think, the late 60s. and they recently celebrated the 50th anniversary. And I was lucky enough that I started going to it when I was just a baby. You know, like my mom tells stories of driving Clyde Robert Bulla through the snow, and me being held in his arms as we were going to Warrensburg. You know, so that's so I grew up going to the festival. I grew up knowing children's authors. I grew up getting all my grandfather's review copies, all those sort of things. So I really grew up like immersed in children's literature, long past the point that a lot of my peers had sort of moved on to reading adult books. I mean, I also moved on to reading young adult books and reading adult books. But like when I was in college, I was also still reading. I would go to the Northfield Public Library and I would check out children's books, or I would go and find children's books that I loved and read those alongside my English major books. So, so I knew I loved children's literature all my life. And then when I was in high school, my mom gave me a book called Great Careers for Readers, because I decided I wanted to do something, have a career that involved reading in some way, because that was what I loved the most in the world. And I read about being a book editor, and I thought, that sounds really amazing. And so I went to college with the thought that I was going to become a book editor. And I became an
straight to it, never any divergence. Like, this is what I will do.
Well, I mean, before that, I thought, you know, I was a smart girl, quote unquote, and smart girls, I was encouraged to be a doctor. My dad really wanted me to be a doctor, and I got through high school biology, and I was like, I do not like cutting things up, and this is not what I'm passionate about, you know. And then it's like, what am I passionate about? Well, it's reading. And so where do I find a career that's reading? I did think about being a librarian instead, but I felt like I wanted to really be involved with making the books. First of all, I wanted to try that at least. And so yeah, I went straight to editing. And after college, I went to Carleton College in Minnesota, which is a really nice school that very few people have heard of. And I always had to work in the summers to make money for during the school year. So I never came to New York and did an internship. And so after college, and internships are important as like a way of making connections and getting experience. So after college, I went to what's called the Denver Publishing Institute. And I describe it as publishing camp, basically. And while I was there, I met Susan Hirschman, who was the founding editor of Green Willow Books. And she talked about her experience editing Robin McKinley and William Steig and all these amazing people. And I was like, it was literally like I was sitting there listening to her, and it was like a light shone down on me from above. It was like, this is what you should do. Go, my child. And I was like, yes. And I wrote to her, and I was like, I would love to work for you. And she wrote back and she said, I don't have any jobs available, but Arthur Levine is hiring an assistant right now. And she sent my resume to Arthur, and Arthur interviewed me, and it was a terrible, terrible interview because I knew that I was a big Harry Potter fan by that point. This was the summer of 2000, right after Goblet of Fire had come out. And I knew that he edited the books, and I really wanted to work for him. And so as a result, whenever I get really nervous, I sort of shut down quite often. Like, that's the way I manage a lot of emotional overload. And so he thought I was very sweet and very shy. And because my eyes are really bloodshot, possibly a pothead. but he
was not a disqualifier.
He was like, he gave me the opportunity to write readers' reports, which I had learned how to do at Denver. And so basically I got the job on the strength of my writing skills for writing readers' reports. And that turned out it worked out pretty well all around for both of us, I think. So, yeah.
So the interview doesn't go well, but then you get the job, and then he sees the quality of your output. At what point does he say, this person goes from the assistant to being the continuity editor on the biggest books we've ever had or probably ever will have? I would almost have to guess.
Yeah. Well, as an editorial assistant, like, really, you are your boss's right hand. That's your job, is and trying to supply all the things your boss might need during the course of the day, and be backup on any sort of editing work that they do. And at the same time, you're an apprentice because you're like watching all the editing work that they do, and you're seeing like how do they phrase questions to the author, and why are they asking this and not that? What is important to ask questions about, and all this. So definitely, I was doing all of that. Like, book 5 was the first book that we had the charity books, which were like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and Quidditch Through the Ages. We worked on those, and I prove myself useful because I'm really detail oriented, and I have a background in copy editing to some extent, and so those things are both really useful when you're working with a big multifarious world. And so on book 5, I again like served as backup to Arthur, in the sense that the way we eventually described it was that like when you're editing, you have to keep track of both the facts and the feelings, because like the facts of what's going on in the story greatly influence, and how real everything is greatly influence how you feel about it. Like if you're in a book and the hero suddenly pulls out a sword from nowhere, and you're like, wait a minute, he's been wearing a loincloth. Where was he carrying a sword? Like that sort of the lack of fact there and the underlying reality would impact your feeling about how awesome the moment might be when he pulls out a sword. So the way we eventually described it, or I described it, is that Arthur kept track of the feelings, and I took care of the facts. and obviously, like, he was also keeping track of the facts too. Like, that's just part of the editorial job. But like, I was trying to keep track of all the things, like, how is Bertie Bott's every flavor bean spelled? Like, do we leave the U in every flavor bean? Do we all the little, if you say Alohomora, what spell does that correspond to? What action should happen? Which hand does Harry carry his wand in? All of those sort of detail, factual things that we needed to try to keep consistent throughout this huge, gigantic world. I sort of took over some of that, and that allowed Arthur to concentrate on his relationship with J.K. Rowling and the feeling, the emotional experience that the reader was having.
So surely you don't start with Harry Potter. How many books are you working on and working with him before you get to, okay, now I'm all the way? And you were a Harry Potter fan, you said before. Were you a real big Potterhead, or were you a casual fan? Where was your level of fandom before you became a part of the family?
I was a reader fan. Like, I had read all of the books. I first heard about the book when I was driving to college. Literally, I can tell you, I was driving to college with my roommate for our senior year, and she had book 3 in the back seat while she was driving, and so I started reading it, and that's how I got hooked on Harry Potter. And I read books 1 and 2 over the course. I finished book 3. I read books 1 and 2 over the course of the next year, and then I went to a midnight party for book 4. And right before I went to the Denver Publishing Institute. And then I spent most of the first day of the Denver Publishing Institute reading book 4. And I'm not sorry. And then, so.
Well, it was an important career move, although I don't know that you knew it at the time.
That's true. And I should say, when I say I'm not sorry, I say I am not sorry for my experience as a reader in that way, because I loved all the experience of reading those books, and I think I still love the experience of reading those books when I go back into them. But I will acknowledge up front that it is a different time now. Those books were written at a specific time, and time has moved on, and J.K. Rowling has moved on to a much different approach to where she seems to be really into transphobia now. And so while I love the book still, I totally understand people who have decided that they cannot love the books, or that they used to love the books and they regret it, and they've stepped back from J.K. Rowling altogether. Like, especially a lot of the younger Harry Potter fans I know who grew up on the series. It's been a really painful last year, I think, for a lot of people, and I'm really sorry about that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I tell you what, I've got a few Harry Potter questions, and then we're going to move on because I told you before we started that talking to you and not talking about Harry Potter is like interviewing Neil Armstrong and never once bringing up the moon.
There it
Um,
is.
but I do want to talk about Leon Lowe and all the things that you've done since.
Yeah.
But my God, that experience, the working on those last two books, the whole world wants to know how's it all end, and that's got to be like the literary equivalent of walking around like a beetle. Yeah, what's that experience like?
What I used to tell people is that, yeah, it was pretty awesome, I will say. like, like having these big secrets about what happened, and being like one of 10 people in North America who knew what happened or something like that. Like that was really, really cool. I do not deny that in any way. But a lot of times people would say to me like, what happened? Can you tell me anything? And what I would say is, you don't want me to tell you. You want J.K. Rowling to tell you. And that's true, because like if I said, if they said, who's the Half-Blood Prince? And I said, Severus Snape, they'd be like, oh, like the fun is all in figuring out the mystery and going along with Harry and discovering all the stuff yourself and being caught up in that. Like again, it's like the facts and the feelings thing. The facts aren't what make a book exciting. It's the feelings that the book creates in you. And that's something that only J.K. Rowling and the experience of reading the book could provide. So it was very special and very exciting. But I also always stayed aware that like I was just a handmaiden on the road to getting the book out, to like telling the story in the way that the author wanted to tell the story. And that was the important thing.
I read, I saw you talk on Nightline about being stopped by a security guard while you've got the manuscript in your bag, and you're walking around basically with the nuclear codes at that time.
Yeah.
What kind of security measures were in place, and how terrified were you that somebody was just going to jack your backpack and make off with the manuscript and it's online tomorrow? Or maybe 3 days. I don't remember how fast the internet was back then.
Actually, the great thing about all of that was that I was like, part of the reason they sent me was that I was just random 20-something number 488. Like I wasn't married. I didn't have a family at the time, anything like that. My best friend at the time, she actually lived in England, so I always enjoyed going to England, and so I could just go over there and nobody paid attention to me. Like, like nobody knew who I was. Nobody cared. And it was lovely to be sort of anonymous and know that I was carrying this thing. I mean, there's certainly the temptation to, like, when you're standing in a gift shop to be like, I have the Harry Potter manuscript, that was sort of like a low rumble in your brain. But it's also like, if you did that, people would be like, I don't believe you. Like, why would anybody think that? Like that would just be like a crazy thing to say. Like, because obviously nobody would do that. So it was fun, but being anonymous, and important was fun, I guess.
Well, enough time has passed. Did you ever say anything to anybody just to test it out or spoil it just a little bit, just to see what that feels like to tell somebody something secret that only you could know?
The year that I was working on book 7 was also the year I was dating my now husband for the first year, and there was a certain amount of teasing of him that went on.
Well, that resolved itself. He's married. Yeah. You made sure that you kept
I brought him into the family business.
Had to marry him. It was the only way to protect the integrity of the work. Sure.
Right. And he is tall and thin and has bright red hair. So you could also say I married a Weasley.
Well, not to spend forever on this, but I am fascinated by this idea that eventually I'm going to find that quality that I don't possess, but that I believe that certain people must. Like if I were to meet Stephen King, I believe that an ethereal music would play whenever he approached. Like, oh, there's greatness. Now I see it. It's shining out of every pore. regardless of things that have happened with Miss Rowling since the book, and honestly, I'm going to go ahead and say I think she's held it together remarkably well. For considering writers don't want to necessarily become that famous, I wish she was being more responsible, and I have hope that she'll evolve and she'll come back. But at that time, you're already a fan, and I assume you're talking to her, or at least you're aware of her because Arthur is talking to her. Did you notice anything specific about her that is not true of other writers?
The thing I would say that always struck me about her as a writer when we were going through the editorial process was that she was somebody who knew exactly what she wanted. Like she, in the sense that she had a complete vision of the work from beginning to end. Like she knew what the story was going to be. She knew what all the plot developments would be. And like there were times in book 5 we'd say like, oh, could we cut this? And she says, no, that'll be important to book 7. You know, and it's and the I will say that's the Harry Potter series, the longest series I've ever worked on. I've never worked on another 7-book series, but that level of control of your material and of your vision, and knowing how important everything is, and also what is contributing to the. I'm going to keep coming back to this facts and feelings thing. The feeling, the emotional effect you want to create. Like she knew she wanted to have X emotional effect at one time because that makes a difference for Y emotional effect down the road, you know? And that's a thing that I don't often see in writers. I mean, I think writers often have. I mean, by the time I was working with her, she was on book 5 of the series. So, or the time I was seeing her the time I was seeing her at work editorially, she was on book 5 of the series. So, but that's so it takes. I think that's a thing that writers gain through experience. Like that you by writing a lot and seeing what works and what doesn't, and gaining confidence in yourself and mastery over your material. Like that's, I think, what that can contribute to that level of vision and control, and then that ability to achieve the effects you want to have and to know what those effects should be. You had a question later down for about writerly ego. You know,
Sure.
you quoted me somewhere. I don't remember where I said it, but that a writerly ego within certain limits is a good thing, or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds like you. I did want to know what those limits were.
Yeah. And by that I'm sort of thinking about this level of confidence that she has, and this level of vision. Like I think a writerly ego, when you know the story you want to tell, you have confidence that it's a good story, and you have confidence in your ability to carry it out. Then that's to me is a measure of a good writerly ego. When you have, in the sense that you feel you've got the chops that underlie the ego. You know, you've got the ability to achieve these effects and create this amazing story. Then I feel like you have earned the ego, and you've earned the right to be like, no, I'm not going to take that editorial note because that's not contributing to what I want to do. You know. Versus people who are like, I don't want to take that editorial note just because how dare you suggest something to me, or how dare you, I don't know, it's a fine line, because like there's a comment thread somewhere from Anne Rice, the author of the Vampire Lestat books. I think it's on her book about Jesus or something like that. And when I say comment thread, I believe she either wrote an Amazon review of her own book, or she responded to somebody else's Amazon review of her book, where she said, like, I am not edited. I do not allow my work to be edited because my work is perfect, or something, as it comes. And that, I think, is a writerly ego that's gone beyond its own limits. You know, like, if you're not willing to listen to what other people are saying to you about your work and how it's reading to them and how it's playing to them, if you can't find like readers you trust to like reflect you back to you as what they see on the page, that to me is a ego that's kind of gone out of control. But if you're willing to at least listen to what a smart reader is telling you, which is all an editor is a smart reader, and to say like, oh, that was not the effect I wanted to have. Let me tweak this so the effect I want to have. Like that to me is a measure of a good writer and a good use of writerly ego.
What if the author comes to you and says, I don't want to make your change because this will happen later, but their reasoning is completely wrong. So they have a good reason. It's just not a good reason. But they think they do. How do you resolve a situation like that?
This happens more often than you would think. Then at that point, it's my job as a reader to sort of listen very carefully to what they're saying and be sure that my premises are sound in terms of logic. To also be sure, like particularly in the work I do now with diverse books, that I'm not too up in my own head as a white reader, because quite often my experience as a white reader can play differently when working with authors of color. And they might not be writing for me. They might be writing for children of their own communities who would have different experiences than I would, and different vocabularies and different even emotional reactions than I would. And so then I need to be, sometimes I might say like, okay, I trust you to know your own community better than I do, which would be fair. But I can tell them my experience with how things play to a white audience and how things play to a children's book professional audience, meaning both reviewers and librarians, and which is historically, this has been changing, but historically a very typically white audience and a very typically aesthetically minded audience. Like how do the aesthetics of things play out versus the politics of things. And so to come back to your question, like if somebody came to me and said that, I would check my own logic. I would check my positioning as a critic of this. I would listen very carefully to what they have to say, because if they're a good writer, then they clearly know their own mind. And then I would do my best to either let it go or meet them in the middle, or maybe get feedback from maybe get input from other readers. You know, like if it's something that it's like a obvious logical flaw, or what seems to me like an obvious logical flaw, it might be useful to have somebody else read it and see if they also pick up on it. Is this a problem that's going to be a problem for a lot of readers? Or is it just a problem for me because like I notice things like X, Y, Z, and I notice sequences in a way that other people don't notice sequences or something. This is getting very, very quickly into like all the different stuff that goes into an editorial mind and how you think about books editorially. Like my job
that's why we're here.
Okay. Well, like in my job as Lee and Low, it's very interesting because I work with, I'm part of being an editorial director is like I oversee the work of a number of different editors. And one of the nice things about being an editorial director is that you get to help put together a list that draws on the strengths of all your different editors. You know, or I should say I don't get to put together a list, but we all work together to put together a list that reflects a lot of different strengths. And so, for instance, I know about myself that I'm a person who really likes lists and patterns and structure, and that plot structure is very important to me. And so quite often the books I work on will have some kind of formal underlying skeletal structure, I would say, like patterns in how in like these. Well, here I have a book right here that this is coming out. This is Kiyoshi's Walk by Mark Carlins and illustrated by Nicole Wong. And it's coming out next March, and I just got copy. This is my very first copy. I just got it yesterday. And Thank you. Yeah. And so this is a beautiful book about a boy and his grandfather, and Kiyoshi sees his grandfather write a poem, and a haiku, and he wonders, where do poems come from? And his grandfather says, let's go for a walk. So they go for a walk, and they see, like, here they go to the market, and they see some oranges and a cat, and then after they leave the market, his grandfather writes a haiku that sort of reflects on what they have just seen. And Kiyoshi says, oh, poems, does that mean poems come from seeing things? And then they go to another place and they listen to birds. And Kiyoshi says, oh, you find poems by listening. And so basically, like, they go to like 5 different places, and there's 5 different things. And Kiyoshi gets a sense of like the 5 different senses and how they each contribute to the making of poetry. And so this is like, I think of it as like a classic Cheryl Klein book, in the sense that there's this very specific structure that happens in the course of the story. And that really speaks to me in a way that, like, I know, like, I have another editor at Lee and Low who does not like books like this, who has a much more, like, she's much more intuitive, and like, she likes magic realism a lot more than I do. I'm not a magic realist person, and she is. And there's, and I don't think that my books are better than her books or anything like that. Like, I think it's just literally a reflection of our editorial personalities. And the great thing is about having a team like the one we have at Lee and Low is that you put together a lot of different personalities, and you get books for a lot of different readers, you know, because not every book will appeal to every reader. So, so that way we are putting out books for a whole range of readers altogether.
Got you.
Yeah.
So lots to follow up on there. I definitely want to talk about Lee and Low. Before we move on from this idea of ego, we did the Cheryl B. Klein side. We talked about author ego. What about editor ego? How much of an editor ego is healthy, and how much gets in your way, and how do you keep it in check? Because there have to have been moments. My God, you're walking around in your 20s. I have the Harry Potter manuscript. There had to be a little bit of a boost to your self-esteem. It's somewhere in there that maybe got just a little bit larger than was healthy.
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, I'm laughing just because, like, if there's anything, like, certainly, if you are acquiring, what do I want to say about this? Yeah, there are all sorts of ways to have a healthy self-esteem as an editor. Like, if your books are, well, how about this? The measure of success for an editor is generally like how well your books do. You know, like you want to make beautiful objects, but then you want those beautiful objects to find their way into readers' hands, and you want them to sell. So like, the definition of success for an editor is, to some extent, how well do your books sell, or how well are they received by the critics, or what kind of awards do they receive, which often usually corresponds to selling. And there are a whole bunch of factors that we do not control as editors. They're like, I think authors are very used to seeing editors as like all-powerful godheads. And editors do not experience our lives that way at all.
Well, maybe not other editors I've talked to, but you're the executive editor for Lee and Low. Surely you, if anybody would have that, I would think. I'm talking to her.
I mean, certainly, like, yes, we have the ability to make books happen, in the sense that we have the ability to buy manuscripts and to turn them into objects and hopefully get the books out there. But even saying that, like, most editors are subject to the whims of a higher authority, whether it is an acquisitions board or their boss. Like, some houses have you have to go through your boss, and so in that way, like, our power is not untrammeled. Like, it's dependent upon our ability to persuade people above us to let us do this thing. And quite often those people above us are highly influenced by their people above them, which is often, like, at a big corporate house like Scholastic or like Random House or something. It's the book buyers at bookstores. So, like, if the Barnes and Noble rep has said, like in their last meeting, the Barnes and Noble rep said, poetry books never ever sell, then books that involve, then like, it's going to be hard for me to get this little book through my acquisitions board. And in fact, I will tell you, this book, I was pitched this book. The author sent me this manuscript in 2011 when I was at Scholastic.
Wow.
And I loved it immediately. But I thought I shared it with my boss at the time, and he was not into it. And if he wasn't into it, then the editorial board wasn't, certainly the acquisitions team was definitely not going to be into it, because again, it's kind of a quiet manuscript about a grandfather-grandson relationship and poetry. And so I held on to it.
I haven't read it, but just the way you've described it, I can imagine every librarian in the world that wants to talk about poetry, that's the book they would reach for, I would think. It
was a hard sell. It was a harder thing to do. And so much depends upon the house you're at and how the house sees itself. Like if the house sees itself as very literary and thoughtful, like FSG. Like I love the books that my friends at FSG do, and they think they're like the literariest of the literary. Versus if you're at a more commercial house where their goal is to like get their books on the Times bestseller list, all the time or something like that. Then that will influence like what kind of books the editor can acquire there. What kind of books does the house succeed with? Like at Scholastic, we did an amazing job selling middle grade fiction. So if you could get a middle grade fiction to us, like we could blow it out of the water. Other categories we didn't do so well at, and that made it more difficult sometimes to acquire those categories. It's all over the place, and it all shifts over time, and it all depends upon the moods of sometimes the stock market, sometimes the buyers at Barnes and Noble, sometimes this, that, or the other thing. And so, well, coming back to the point you were making about editors and egos, we are also subject to agents, because agents will send us things or not send us things. They will send us things and then announce a week later that they're holding an auction, and we have to have bids in within 3 days, which requires that you must drop everything else you're doing and put together all your materials to acquire this book. And then that means you have to go and like supplicate yourself at the feet of your boss about acquiring this book. So all of which is to say, it's very easy to have a big ego as an editor, but it's also very easy not to. Because you're constantly like having people tell you that you're not good enough, or I don't know if that's not the right phrase. But you're constantly sort of battling to do the books you want, to get support for the books you want, to convince agents to give you the books you want, to get the money to buy books from those agents. Like you don't have time to have an ego because you're constantly convincing other people to let you do things. That's sort of, or talking to authors and trying to get authors to do the things that you want them to do to make the book turn out. Which you think is in the book's interest, which you hope is also what is in the author's interest, to get the author to, I don't know. but all this is to say, I don't know very many editors who have big unhealthy egos, like that. I would say, like I guess
there is much opportunity. If I would have thought, and this continues to amaze me as I do up to the show.
I should also note that this has that there's most of my close editor friends are women, and I think that makes a difference too. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we could probably read between the lines, but if you wanted to explicitly state it, I would allow it. I would be happy to hear it. No, I was going to say what continues to amaze me is I'm talking with authors who, in my mind, have to be the end-all, be-all. I'm talking sometimes with folks that every author I've talked to is amazing, but sometimes I'm talking to somebody that, okay, you've been doing this long enough, you're famous enough, nobody should be able to tell you no. And on the editor side of that, I would think Cheryl Klein, author of Second Sight, that's where you've got to be. Who is at that level? Who can get to that point where nobody tells me no? I have an idea for a book, we're doing it. I Thanos snapped this thing into existence. Is there anybody in publishing that has that, or is everybody in some way having to negotiate?
I mean, I think there are people I can name. Yeah, there are people who I really admire who can make that, who can just do stuff. I think who can get the money just by going like that, and who do great books because of it. But all of us are subject to, not subject, that's the wrong word, but all of us are responsible for persuading our sales team or persuading people like this is how we should spend our money. And this is how much money we should spend. And because we're all responsible for making money in the end, I would say. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So in this world that's, could be influenced by everything you mentioned. Certainly, I'm assuming the.
I mean, how Mifflin Harcourt right now is for sale, and that so is Simon and Schuster, I think, and both of them are owned by larger corporate entities. So that's a stock market thing. Like if if their investors decide that they don't want to spend a lot of money on books, like that does trickle down somewhat to how the editors can spend money.
So with all those factors coming into play, how do you make your peace with a business that's crazy, and how should authors make their peace with so much that's out of the control of all the artists involved?
Yeah. Oh, well, that is a great question. And what I tend to say is control what you can control. And that is the quality of your writing and what you are putting into that writing. Like you can't control when a book is going to strike an editor at the perfect time, or whether the editor will be at the perfect house to acquire that book. You can do some research and things like that will help you know what place is best. Or agents like always have their ear to the ground for all these sort of things and these underground rumblings. But what writers can control is the story that they have to tell, and how good that story is. And you can think about and maybe also like you can control what story you want to put out in the world at the time. I mean, coming back to Harry Potter for just a minute, I don't actually think this was intentional on J.K. Rowling's part, but the fact that she wrote a huge amount of success of Harry Potter, I think, can be attributed to it being published starting in the year 1997. Because what else was starting in the year 1997 was the internet. And if there ever a book was designed for being discussed by people on the internet, a book series was designed for that, it was Harry Potter. And also the largest high school graduating class of all time graduated in 2008. How old were those people in 2008? And when 1997, they were 9 or 10. They were the perfect age for Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling could not control any of that. She could control the story that she put out there. And then she happened to have the massive good luck of having a huge audience of exactly the right age who all got on the internet and got passionate about discussing these books at the same time. And but what she could control was the writing. And she got rejected by I forget whether it was 12 or 21 or whatever publishers, because at the time she was putting the book out there originally, everybody was like, fantasy, bah, but she believed in the book. And so she kept going. And then the time changed and times changed, and it turned out to be the right time for everything because she had a good book. It was exciting to read.
Is it an apocryphal tale was it author Levine's daughter that discovered the manuscript and said, hey, let's publish this? Or was that somebody at Bloomsbury in UK?
I don't know about daughter. Arthur was given a galley of the book at the Bologna Book Fair by somebody who worked at Bloomsbury.
Okay.
And so it wasn't his daughter, but he doesn't have a daughter actually. But
okay, well, case closed.
Yeah, case closed. But it might have been the agent's daughter or something like that. So yeah.
With that particular book, I know there's so many apocryphal tales. I'm never certain what's actually real, and
Right.
I want to talk about Lee and Low, but since we came back to Harry Potter, one more burning question on that.
Sure.
Having had that experience, and obviously, when I talked with Thomas Taylor, who's the author of The Wonderful Malamander, check the back catalog, esteemed audience. He's worth listening to. His books are worth reading. Great, great author. But he also designed the UK cover for Harry Potter and the
Oh, that's right.
Philosopher's Stone. And so when I asked him about it, because of course, among all the other questions I had for him, he admitted that at times he wished he hadn't been a part of that because he always has to live up and live past that and step outside of the shadow of the biggest series that probably has ever existed or close to. Certainly for I don't know, you would be the person to ask what's bigger than Harry Potter in the world of children's fiction.
Maybe there's not much. I mean, not in hardcover. I mean, things like Rick Riordan, maybe. But and there's like Goosebumps and Magic Tree House and Junie B. Jones, and there's lots of chapter book series that have sold millions of copies just chugging along and don't get the respect that they deserve. For the work that they do down there. But in terms of middle grade or YA hardcover, there's basically Harry and Hunger Games and Rick Riordan, and I feel kind of like that's it. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, my question was coming from that and going forward, knowing that. I don't know, maybe J.K. Rowling comes up with an idea for another Harry Potter and she says, hey, let's get the gang back together. But short of that, it's not that likely that you're ever going to catch that kind of lightning in a bottle again or be a part of something quite that huge. Is that a relief, or do you prefer to work on books that have a dedicated fan base and an audience that you're going to reach, but that you don't have to go on Nightline and address the whole world?
Honestly, like I do think Harry was like I mean, I take no responsibility for being part of it, for creating it in any way. I was just sort of caught up in riding the lightning. My own take on it is more that like I want the thing that I can control. Coming back to the idea of what you can control. I can't control whether any books will ever sell that well again. And to some extent, I don't expect any book to ever sell that well again. But just because I think that the internet has moved on, or the world has moved on. Attention spans are a lot more fractured now. Things are, it's a lot harder to capture people's minds and attention, I think, in the way that Harry did at that one time. Anything now that's published will get compared to Harry, whereas Harry, there wasn't really anything to compare it to, other than in terms of sales before that. So I don't really expect any. I would love to find the thing that I would love to find a book that sells it well, of course. But really, what I would love to find more is a book that makes people feel the way that Harry Potter felt. In the sense that it sweeps people up into a magical world. You fall in love with the characters, or more accurately, perhaps you feel like the characters are your friends, and you want to hang out with them, even if they're just like sitting around bickering about Quidditch or some other obscure sport, and you want to unravel the mysteries, and you want to go on this magical adventure and feel like you're learning things within the magical world. So I would love to find a book that does that, even if it's set in our real world, and it's not a fantasy. I would love to find a book that does that, certainly starring a kid of color that has that same warmth and loveliness. And again, going back to the things I can control, like I can't control necessarily whether that book will come to me, and I can't control whether it'll sell $1 million or sell 1 million copies. But I can control the books I choose to publish, and the level of editorial attention I give them, and the work that I do on them to try to make them as appealing as possible for the readers who are going to find them and who need them. so I try to bring that same, like, whether a book is going to publish, whether I think a book is going to sell 1 million copies or sell 10,000 copies, I try to bring that same level of dedication and thoughtfulness and love to it to make it the best book that it can be for what it's going to be. And that's the thing I can control. Like, yeah.
Speaking of control, let's talk about Leon Low books, because they are seems to be, from the material on the website, very proud of the fact that it is an independent publisher.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Please tell us about Leon Low.
Yeah, Leon Low was published. Leon Low was started in 1991 by two men, Philip Lee and Tom Low, both of them of Asian descent, and both felt like there were not enough books in the world that portrayed contemporary children of color, and they wanted to rectify this gap in the market. And I believe they were one of the first. They weren't the first, but they were one of the first publishers devoted to doing this, like, especially for children. And we're celebrating our 30th anniversary next year, which is great. Yeah, very exciting. Unfortunately, Mr. Low, old Mr. Low, Tom Low, passed away this past year. And the company is sons, Craig and Jason. And it's entirely owned by the Low family. So we don't have any corporate investors. We don't have anybody else telling us what we should publish. We are not subject to the whims of the stock market, like I said earlier. We are only subject to what we want to publish, what we think is important, and what we are excited to bring to our customers, who are, we have a lot of educational customers, a lot of teachers, and school districts that buy our books, and of course we also publish books into bookstores for the trade. So so we publish the books we like, and that's what it means to be independent, I would say, without being subject to the other pressures.
So, a question that I never know what's a good question to ask, and what's maybe verging on rudeness. I'm hoping this is in the good category. 16 years with Arthur Levine. You've got the Harry Potter cred. You could do anything, I would imagine. This might be another assumption that I'm just wrong, but I would think that Cheryl Klein, when you're editing, can go anywhere, do anything. Why Leon Low?
Well, I will say part of it. I had an amazing experience at Arthur Levine Books, and but I had sort of gone as far as I could go within a named imprint. You know, a named imprint is like a small ship, and there's always a captain. and I was never going to be the captain of that ship. And I'm a ambitious person. I wanted the opportunity to, like, be an editorial director myself and work with younger editors and figure out what a list looked like and all those sort of things. And that's the way I think. That's the way I think most editors feel quite often. I mean, I think there are some of them who only ever want to edit, but a lot of us want to be like editorial director and work with other editors and direct a list and help put all that together. And that was a thing I wanted experience with, and it was just not a thing I could get experience with at Scholastic. I also really, at the time that all of this happened, it was 2016. It was right after the election, and the capital T, capital E, the election, and I was feeling very strongly like, and this is something that's been evolving throughout my career, but I'd always been interested in working with underrepresented authors and telling stories of underrepresented people, in part because it is good to. We need more stories like that in the world, obviously, but also, like, for my own taste as a reader, like, it was just fascinating to discover new worlds that I, growing up with, had never met, like, or never encountered, like. One of the books I published at Scholastic, I published 2 books by Sarwat Chadha that were set. There were in India, and they basically drew on Indian mythology, the goddess Kali, and the various demons in Indian mythology. And that was something I did not know anything about or hadn't encountered at all when I was a kid. I hadn't heard about it until I got to college and heard about comparative religions. So to bring that book out, to make those kinds of stories more widely available, to show kids that the world is so much bigger than what you might see growing up in Peculiar, Missouri, like that felt really important to me. And it was both like a delight to me as a reader to be finding all these new worlds to read for myself and to be sharing those with kids. And it felt important to me, like particularly at that time, that that I be involved in uplifting the voices of marginalized writers. And I don't say that to make myself important in any way, because there are editors who have been doing this work for much longer than I have, and Arthur among them, my friend Nami Tripathi at Kokala Books, who does amazing books, Stacey Barney, a whole range of amazing editors, Nancy Paulson, who I very much admire. So I don't say this to like as a reflection of editorial ego or anything like that, but that was the sort of, if we were picking sides and after the election, that was the fight I wanted to be involved in. Like I wanted to be involved in putting more of these stories out there. And Lee and Low, we went through a long discussion process, I would say, as part of the interviewing, and Lee and Low felt like a good place to be doing that. So it was a nice opportunity for me to grow as an editor and a person at a time when I was ready for that challenge, and a time when I felt like I was really motivated to do more books by and about people of color, which is Lee and Low's whole mission. So that's why I chose to move.
Good for you. What a wonderful reaction to such a terrible event in 2016.
Well, it was again luck and timing and everything else, and yeah. So, which is most of publishing is luck and timing.
I'm beginning to believe it. I really was suspicious before I started this podcast, and this is episode 100, and I think I've been convinced.
Hard work. I should not leave out hard work. Hard work makes a big difference, and I have done a fair amount of hard work in my time too. So, but yeah.
Well, it's another quote from you that I wanted to ask you about and unpack a little bit. I think we talked a little bit about the white reader, but you mentioned the cheerful privilege of the white reader. And this is a phrase I had not come across before, but I love it. So if you would, what does that mean? What is the cheerful privilege of the white reader?
Could you remind me where I said this?
On the website where... No, is the answer. On the Lee and Low site. But where no, because I've been listening to multiple podcasts with you and
right.
reading multiple sites.
Because I think whenever I'm talking about race, particularly, I think it's useful. It's always useful to put things in context and to know what I was saying and what I was talking about. So I think that phrase, the cheerful privilege of the right reader, I would guess that when I was talking about it, I think the privilege of the white reader is to some extent always think of yourself as a blank slate, and to think of yourself as as the default. Like when you're reading a book and no matter you're reading a book and another character walks on screen, is the character's race named? If it is not named, then 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, it's usually safe to assume that character is white, because we assume that people look like us. I think quite often that's what we're projecting, and unless we are given evidence to the contrary, like a boy with dark skin walks onto the page or whatever. That is how the white reader tends to default in their thinking, and that is a privilege. That I I mean, that's an example of white privilege, I will say. I hesitate to say it in the way that is a privilege because I feel like there's a better word than privilege. Although it's not coming to me. Like that is a
almost like a learned behavior, something in that neighborhood.
What? I'm sorry?
Like a learned behavior, something in that neighborhood.
Behavior. It's I was gonna say it's an unfair advantage. It's an unfair advantage to always be centered. It's an unfair advantage to always think of yourself as the center of the story, and to quite often always be the center of the story. Because when you are always the center of the story, then you don't. I think the classic person who is always the center of the story is Donald Trump. Like Donald Trump has not had to be the sideline of anybody else's story for his entire life. He is always he's obviously like the worst and most curdled and cartoonishly bad version of that. But like,
you don't think he's just so happy always being the star?
Oh, sure. It's very easy to be happy always being the center of attention. It's very easy.
I don't think he's been happy a day in his life. That's very facetious, that question.
But it's very easy to be, but it very easily can make you a terrible person too. And I think quite often with white people, it's very easy for us not to pay attention to anybody else because we get to be the center of the story so easily. And I mean, there are hundreds of Black writers and writers of color who've talked about all this much more eloquently than I can or will, but that we when I say cheerful privilege, it is a happy privilege. It is a lucky ignorant thing. You're just in this little happy bubble, and you don't really have to pay attention to anything else. But I think if there's anything we have seen in the last few years, and I think that white people more and more are recognizing, it's that for the health of the world, especially for the health of this poor country of ours, we need to burst that bubble a little bit more. We need to be more cognizant of the world beyond ourselves, and engage with that more. And so, I mean, one of the things I'll say is like I learned a lot from I've learned about this a lot from my authors, especially the authors of color who I've worked with. I always think about Olagbumasola Rude Perkovich, who I published her first book, 8th grade Super Zero, when I was at Scholastic, and I learned a ton from working with her, in part because she would call me on this, like on the page, like if I like there was one point there's one point where her characters were walking down the street and they went into a Chinese restaurant in Brooklyn and they got French fries. And the copy editor said, should we explain to people like people don't think of, in other parts of the country, people don't think of kids going into Chinese restaurants and getting French fries. Like that's not a thing. You would go into Chinese restaurants and get maybe crab rangoon or something, although that's also not a real Chinese thing. But it is a totally normal thing in New York. Like there's lots of Chinese restaurants that'll sell you like a $1 packet of French fries. And so I think either the copy editor or I said to Bimmy, like we said, should we explain to readers what's going on here? Like you could buy French fries for $1 or something, and to how like. And I was thinking specifically of like people like me in Kansas City, Missouri, as a kid would have been very confused by that whole reference, like, and think that somebody had made a mistake, that these kids were buying French fries in a Chinese restaurant. And I said, I think I wrote a note to Bimmy that was like, would you be willing to amend the text slightly to explain this? And she wrote back, I won't, this isn't gospel, but she wrote back something like, no, because I'm not writing for white girls and this is not what she did not say white girls, but she said, I'm not writing for kids in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm writing for Black kids in Brooklyn. And Black kids in Brooklyn will know that you can buy French fries in the Chinese restaurant. And that was a big lesson to me as an editor. And it's still something I think about, like when I am querying writers, like who is the person that we are writing for? How wide do we want to cast our net informationally? Like to some extent, like there are some writers who might say, like, sure, I'm willing to explain that because, you know, it doesn't make a big difference. Like some writers might feel like it doesn't make a big difference to explain it. And other writers feel like, no, it's betraying my audience to explain it. And so who are we going for here? How can we reach? Do we want to reach the most people, or do we want to reach the specific slice of people? Like, these are all questions that I think about all the time and wrestle with all the time, and wrestle with my authors on the page, you know, or like us trying to define who are we writing for? What are we doing? Who are we publishing for? All those
compromise with like a footnote. Dear Missouri girls, just so you know, in Brooklyn.
Well, sometimes people do that. Like, I mean, another book that I learned a lot from in that exact same way was The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, which has footnotes, exactly like you say, some of which explain stuff like this about like Dominican history. This is an adult book, but some of which explain, you know, like the casual references to Dominican history, they explain it. And some of the footnotes, if I remember right, are in Spanish, not translated. And I read high school Spanish, but like I didn't know what was going on in those footnotes. And it was a really powerful and important experience for me to read that book and feel like, this is not meant for me. And that's okay. You know, and that's the cheerful privilege of the right reader, is to think like, this is not meant for me, or this is everything. The cheerful privilege is to think everything should be for me, and that everything should be edited to serve me. You know, and if it isn't edited to serve me, then it's bad. Like aesthetically, it does not work, or it doesn't make sense, or I mean, you see this sometimes with men and women, like male writers and like male readers saying this book is bad because it's a book written by a woman and it talks about things I don't want to think about, you know, stuff like that. Or female writers who make fun of the way that male writers write women, like with excessive attention to their breasts or whatever. This is all in adult books, more than children. But yeah, that's
that. But I know I could think of a few middle grade examples where nope, there it is. There's the male gaze.
Yeah,
right here in our book intended for 4th and 5th graders.
And so if a male gaze is in a book, or if a man is reading a book and it's all female gaze, then they can be made uncomfortable by that, you know, and be like, this is a bad book. Well, that's the privilege of the male reader, to say like, this is a bad book, even though it's just not a book that is meant for you. And I think all of us as readers could be more thoughtful about what books are meant for us and how we judge books that might not be meant for us. Or be open to like what makes good books and what is different. What values we have that are how we define good books. These are questions. I say all this like I have some kind of definitive answers, and I don't. Like basically, like I'm very aware, like especially when I'm editing cross-culturally, like that I am a person who does not have all the answers, and that I need to be humble about that the whole time. Like that's important to like acknowledge what you do not know, I would say.
So you're editorial director. You've got a list of all the strengths of the different editors that you've got there at your disposal. How do you compensate for that? Because obviously I can't ask you definitively, how do you decide between making sure you're accessible to as many readers as possible and making sure that you're true to the voice of the author? Only you can know that on any individual book. And right. I'm guessing over your career, there's maybe been 1 or 2 times where you still aren't sure these many years later. I'm guessing.
I can tell you about editorial arguments I had 10 years ago. Because I mean, I think anything that makes you sort of chew over, am I right or am I wrong, is, I think it's, in my experience, it's both like painful, but also a good thing. Like, I think a lot of those things have made me a better human being as well as a better editor. So in terms of compensating editorially, like as an editorial director, I think about like, what does our list need? You know, what kind of books should we be putting out there that we maybe aren't? And how could I find an editor who would want to do those kind of books? You know, who is passionate about doing science nonfiction? I would love to hire that person, you know, because I can do science nonfiction and I have, but I won't say it's one of my strengths. And it's something I'd like to learn more about, but there are editors who are like, do amazing science nonfiction. And so that would be a great thing to have on our list, like that sort of thing. What else? I mean, you asked about, another thing about editorial ego is like, and this is something I think to myself all the time, is like, what is the, and this is something I think about too in writing, is like, what is the most important thing? That is a question that I use all the time, is with a writer and the editor, or who is the most important person right now. And like, if I'm doing a project and I'm weighing like, should we cut this line? Like, the question is, what is the most important thing? The most important thing is it at this moment, is it telling the reader how the character feels, or is it keeping the story moving? And if it turns out that like right now the more important thing is the momentum of the story, then yeah, we should cut this line because it's taking away from the momentum of the story. So then I might make my argument for that in the margin of the manuscript about like, I won't use the phrase like the most important thing is the momentum of the story, but that would be like my underlying argument, is like, listen, right now the most important thing is that we keep this book going. Like, you are on a tear here, and we do not want to distract the reader by having this random reference to something that happened 40 pages ago. So can we just cut this line? So that's the thing I use a lot in editing. And it's the thing I use a lot, like, if I'm having an argument with somebody, like, is the most important thing how I feel right now? Or is the most important thing getting, and then I mean this on a personal level, like, is the most important thing like making our relationship work well enough that we can carry through and keep doing this book, you know? In some cases, how I feel is really important, and in some cases it is not. And especially and this is the thing I've also learned about editing cross-culturally, is like, quite often as a white person, my feelings are not the most important thing, and it's very dangerous if I center them. Because the more important thing is telling the stories of people who have helped, not telling the stories, but helping the stories of writers who have not been historically well represented. Helping those stories get out there is the most important thing. And so, like, I have said, an example I think about, I've said stupid things, and they have people and writers have gently like set me down, and I have thought, and I felt hurt by that or upset by that, but then I've been like, how I feel is not the most important thing. The important thing is like, I have just learned something and I should move along with this. And I mostly try to do that most of the time. So, yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. Was that like, when I was working on a book, the first book I ever worked on with a Native American author was Eric Gansworth's If I Ever Get Out of Here, which is a really wonderful, powerful middle grade YA novel. He's 13, so he's right at the cusp, about music, and it's set on the Tuscarora Indian Reservation in upstate New York in the early 1970s. And or maybe the mid 1970s. It's been a few years. And anyway, I was writing the book copy for it, and I tried to make some pun about reservations, like he's off the reservation, or he has no reservations about what he's doing or something like that. And Eric very gently was like, no. It's like, that's really cheesy. Everybody has done that. No, we do not do this thing. And I was like, all right. I'm not used to authors pushing back on my copy. And sometimes I feel like, oh man, I labored so hard on this. But in this case, I was wrong and it was cheesy and he called me on it. And that's a good thing, And so, so even if I felt bad, like it was important to me not to carry that forward, but to learn the lesson and go from there. So.
And you did immediately, and you said, "Okay, well, I'm wrong. We'll just rewrite it, and that's it." Or would it, let me sit on this for 24 hours? And
I mean, I think I probably did sit on it for like 24 hours, and then I was like, okay, I mean, God knows I don't want to put bad copy out there. I don't want to put cheesy copy out there. So, so it was a useful thing all around. But I mean, I guess this comes back to that ego point too, is like about writerly ego, like. I think whatever kind of ego you have, when you stop listening to other people, that's the dangerous point. Like not to everybody. You've got to like keep your own vision and your own sense of what you're doing. But if there are thoughtful people around you who want to help you do what you're doing better, and who understand what you're doing, and who share your goals, then like you need to be listening to them. And so, yeah.
But seems like a good rule of thumb to live by.
Yeah.
I've got some burning editorial questions about some things you said. Because I think I told you in my initial letter that I bought Second Sight immediately when it came out. I said, "Oh my God, the editor of Harry Potter! This book will have everything I ever need to know," and it did. It was a good purchase. So I've got some questions about that, but it would be irresponsible of me not to at least mention the fact that you do have a book coming out here in the very near future. What can you tell us about A Year of Everyday Wonders, available December 8th?
Yeah. Yes, A Year of Everyday Wonders. It's a picture book. It'll be my third picture book. Yes. And what it does is it actually grew out of my own habit of noting the firsts as I go through a year. So like on January 1st, I will say like, oh, this is the first morning of the new year. And then I will have a cup of coffee. I'll be like, this is my first cup of coffee of the new year. And then later as things go along, it's like...
my first panic attack of the new year. Oh, how exciting.
Well, there's that. Or like, my first cold of the new year. But or even better, like the first day I can sleep without a big heavy blanket on the bed. The first day you go outside without wearing a jacket. The first time you go to the beach, the first ice cream cone of the year, all those different things. And so I've always noted these habits, these little things, just like for fun in my own mind. And one day I sat down and I basically turned them into a book, like that runs through the calendar year, starting in January and going through to the following December. And it's all these little firsts. And then there's also kind of a subtle story built in there, because on the first day of the new year, the main character has a first fight with her brother. And then later there's a 98th fight with your brother. And then later the 222nd fight with your brother. And but you also see them sort of reconcile in the course of the year. And it was really fun to write because it's entirely written in firsts. There are no characters named. There is no narration. It's just these lists of firsts or lasts or thirds or whatever it might be. And so in that way, it was really fun to leave space for an illustrator to come in and fill in all those details about like who is the character and what is the family like. And I mean, actually, the text didn't even specify is the main character male or female, or non-binary or whatever. So the illustrator got to fill that in as well. You only knew that the main character had a brother, basically. And there are certain things set by the text that dictate a little bit, like the fact that there's a snowfall indicates that probably they're living in the Northeast or the north of the country as opposed to the South. And it's very definitely the United States in various ways. I think there's fireworks at the 4th of July, but it's an interesting manuscript in both like the poeticism of it and kind of the negative space it left for the illustrator to fill in. And it was bought by Emma Ledbetter at Abrams, who does lovely, lovely picture books. And I say that as one of her authors, obviously, but even so, she does great picture books. I say that as an editor admirer as well. And she hired Chin Ling, who is a Canadian illustrator. And Chin was perfect because she is very character oriented, and she captures like a lot of those little emotional moments and gestures and things that really define who a personality is in illustration. And so she was a great person to kind of like fill in the missing spaces left by the text. And the book turned out really, really beautifully, and I'm really pleased with it and proud of it. So
what a tremendous amount of trust that you're not even picking a gender. You do that, illustrator, and I hope it comes out wonderful, because my entire book kind of more or less rests on you doing a wonderful job. Is that because over so many years and previous picture books, you've learned that you can trust an excellent illustrator? Or how do I get to that state of zen, like, let me trust the illustrator because I don't and I aspire to?
I mean, yeah, I have extreme privilege here in that, like, I have seen this, I have made this process happen myself in that I'm an editor. So I know the magic that can happen. I know the thing that can be done. And if you're working with a good editor whom you trust, and I think at this stage, I think most editors are giving authors at least some input into their illustrator selection. They're saying, like, I'm thinking about these 3 people. Who do you like? At least I almost always do that, and I think most editors do. Maybe I'm wrong. We do that at Lee and Low too. Then if you have a sense of what the illustrator is capable of, it's a lot more easy to relax and trust things in that way. If you trust and I also got to look at the sketches at one point, and I got to give feedback on those, and that was useful too, because like at that point I went through and I sort of tweaked some of the phrases to try to work better with what Chin was doing. And actually, when I submitted the manuscript, I made it very clear that I was open to tweaking things with however the illustrator might want to handle it. And I think most of that comes from, again, like a sense of humility in knowing what I am capable of and what I am not capable of, and recognizing what I can bring to a manuscript versus what an illustrator can bring to a manuscript. And illustrators, like, it's their job to bring character and drama and all those sort of things through just the illustration. What I'm providing is the structure and ideally some insight, some what's the word I want? Some pithy little phrases that move the reader along. I mean, my first book, Wings, has only 12 words in it, and they all rhyme, and that one, like, even more, I was trusting the illustrator because it was entirely dependent on the illustrator to, like, really craft what the action was and the emotion of this little bird who's trying to fly for the first time. And Tama DePaula did the illustrations in that. And at first, I will tell you, like, when Emma edited that book too, and at first when she pitched him to me, I was like, I'm not sure about this, because I mostly knew him from, like, the Stregonona books and things like that. And I knew he was a wonderful illustrator, but I wasn't sure. I thought maybe somebody with more detail was needed to flesh out a text that had only 12 words. And Emma said, no, he really loves drawing birds, and I think he'll do a great job with this. And then when I saw his sketches and the final book, like, his very elemental shapes, like his strong plain shapes, like, ended up being the perfect counterpoint to my text, which is, like, all about the shape of the words, like, I'm getting very mystical here, kind of.
I'm nodding like I understand. I don't understand. Please explain.
Okay. Like, the text for wings runs wings, and you see a little bird flapping her wings, clings, and then you see the bird at the edge of a nest, flings, and she flings herself out of the nest, and then you see her falling, and then stings because she crashes on the ground, rings because she's lasted in a puddle, and so she wrings herself out, and then dings, and she's hurt her tail a little bit, and it goes on from there. But it's a very simple text. It's providing just basically the plot structure of what she does, and providing the pleasure of the sound of the words altogether. And for the readers, the pleasure of guessing like what's going to be the next word, because obviously they all have to rhyme. And but because there's no sentences there, there's just like one part of speech per spread, basically. There's like one noun or one verb. That's it. Like that's what I mean by it being very elemental. Like there's just one very strong element in that word. It's not like a very rococo, long, flowery sentence or anything like that. And so in that way, like Tommy DePaola's illustration, with his style being very blocky and being, a lot of strong lines and very simple shapes, like that was a good match for the sound of my text. Does that make sense?
That does make more sense. I got you.
Yeah, visually, it was a visual counterpoint to the sound of my text. And so that made them a good partnership as words, as for words and pictures. In the same way that like Chin Ling's illustrations, bringing out all the character, really filled in the backstory and everything else for my text, which sort of outlined, for A Year of Everyday Wonders, which sort of outlined all these character things that happened, but didn't elaborate on them. Like she was able to elaborate on them visually.
Gotcha.
Whereas I just provided the structure and the space for all of that to happen. So I obviously think about this a lot. I don't mean to praise my books as like, oh yeah, I wrote a great book, blah blah blah. But I do want to praise.
If you didn't think that, why'd you publish it? Right?
Well, that's true. I'm a Midwesterner. I have to denigrate myself.
Sure, I understand.
I'm not allowed to be unself-deprecating by my own cultural standards. But no, I do think they're good books. But I really do also think that the great amount of the credit for that goes to the illustrator and how well the choice of the illustrator matched what I was doing in the text. So, and coming back to what you say about confidence, like I had confidence because I believed in my text. I believed in the illustrator. I believed in the editor. And I really, really love picture books that do tricks of the kind I'm describing, and by tricks I mean like having a picture book text that's only 12 words. That's kind of a neat trick to pull off, or having a picture book text that is just composed of little phrases. Like one of the picture books I come back to again and again. I don't have it here. I don't think I actually have a copy of it floating around just recently. Is A Hole Is to Dig by Ruth Krauss.
Okay.
And if you've never looked this up, this is a book from the 1950s, illustrated by Maurice Sendak. But it's called A Child's First Book of Definitions, and it's all things like a hole is to dig, a hole is to put a seed into, a hole is hole is for a dog to bury a bone in. Like it's all definitions like that, and it's very modular, kind of. Like there's lots of pieces that come together to form the text of the book, and that makes it a neat book. And I love books that do cool things like that. Like my favorite picture book, one of my favorite picture books ever is Charlie Parker Played Bebop by Chris Roshka, which has entire spreads that are nothing but scat, like in the jazz sense, like the way Ella Fitzgerald scatted, and it's like barbecue, barbecue, barbecue bar, like overshoes, overshoes, overshoes. Oh, this is actual text in this book, and it really makes you aware of the pleasure of saying those words out loud, and it goes really well with the illustrations, and the book itself like ends up embodying the spirit of bebop, in both its text and its art. And I just think it's magical. I love it. Every single time I read it, I am delighted by that book. And I feel that way about most of Chris Rashka's books. He came into the office once when I was working at Scholastic, and I like peered over the cubicle like he was a Backstreet Boy or something like that. Like I was like, oh my gosh, it's Chris Rashka. And I still feel that way about a lot of his books. Just because they do such cool things in the space that a picture book makes. Because the picture book is like such a cool artistic space. Because it's got a very regimented. Oh Lord, I can go on about this all the time. It's a very regimented form. It's usually 32 or 40 or 48 pages, and it can't be any more than that, and it can't be any less than that because that's the way you print it. And within that, you have to find the right text to work with the illustrations to make a story that flows from beginning to end within this confined space of like 15 spreads and 2 single pages at the beginning and end. And you have to like work in certain things that are important to the form, like a title page or something like that. And it's like writing a sonnet when you're writing a picture book, because you have to make everything fit in the form. But then you add all the stuff that comes in from the visuals, like what are the things that you don't want to say because you know that the illustrations are going to pick them up. Like with A Year of Everyday Wonders, like all the stuff I didn't say about the character because I knew that the illustrator could fill them in. And so, yeah, it's a magical form, and there's so many cool things you can do with it. And I feel like, and I get really excited about working in books that I get really excited when I find books that are doing those cool things. Like I've got a book coming out that I'm editing that's coming out a year maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but it's a little ways off. But it's by a man who identifies as autistic. It's called Flap Your Hands by Steve Asbell, and it's a book about the practice of stimming, where neurodiverse people and autistic people sometimes do a certain kind of repetitive motion in order to emotionally calm themselves or center themselves, or because it feels pleasurable. And it might be like waving your hands in the air or clapping them or something like that. And it's a thing that like we non-autistic, I think allistic is the word, people do as well, like when you might just like tap your fingers on your leg or something like that when you're bored. Like we all stim, even if we don't think about it.
I'm a notorious hummer.
Yeah. And so the book like celebrates the practice of stimming, and it does it in this really cool visual way where it shows 4 different kids like sort of doing their own things, and then it all comes together and unites. So it unites them in the pleasure and the practice of stimming, and so it's doing the kind of thing I love the most, in that it's a neat book that is doing something cool visually that can only be done by the picture book form over the 32 pages. But in this case especially, it's representing a group that has not been represented before. Like there haven't been a lot of picture books about autistic people, and there certainly haven't been very many written and illustrated by a person from that community who's speaking from within that community. And so I'm hugely excited about the book, and I'm bringing it out because, like I said, it does all the things I like best.
And that'll be available when?
Either late next year or early 2022, and the things are sort of up in the air with a lot of stuff.
It's been that kind of year, sure.
It's been that kind of year.
Cheryl Klein, where did our time go? It flew by. It's been glorious. I've got I got maybe 2 more questions, and we could call it a night. Is that fair and reasonable?
That sounds good. Yeah.
I always want to end while we're having a good time, and this has been phenomenal. As great as I knew it would be, it's been 10 times better.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about a lot of things that I think about a lot, but I don't often get to talk about, like the privilege of the white reader thing. Like that's a thing that I wrestle with all the time, but nobody ever asked me about that. So thank you.
If you feel like you have more thoughts later and you're like, man, I really want to talk some more about this, come back. You're welcome anytime. Esteemed audience knows that I have to ask, and they think I'm going to check it out because it's Cheryl Klein. I'm not. I ask everybody, Cheryl Klein, have you ever seen a flying saucer and or a ghost?
No and no.
I wasted a final question on that. Oh, shoot. Then my absolute final question is always some variation of, for all the things that that we would have teased out if only I had asked the correct questions, and maybe will in the future. If there were one or two or however many pieces of advice you like, that you would want every author listening, or maybe even every editor as well listening, to take to heart, that would make their journey toward publication or after publication toward becoming a Daniel Jose Older level superstar, if it would make that journey easier, what would you tell them?
Well, since you mentioned Daniel, I will say go and find his essay, Writing Begins with Forgiveness. If you Google Daniel Jose Older, Writing Begins with Forgiveness, I think that's a great piece about writing and building a writing life for yourself that's also mentally healthy. It's a lovely essay. I would say focus on the things that you can control. Again, coming back to that, control what you can control. And what you can control is your writing. And the story that you find that you have to tell that feels important to you and comes from a deep place inside you, or and then focus on what you have to say. Because it's very easy to write something without actually having anything to say. But
I do it all the time, sure.
Yeah, but I think the best books come from and sometimes you may write something and you don't know what you have to say, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, that's what I'm saying. There's a E.M. Forster quote, I know what I think when I see what I say, that I think about a lot. But be sure you have something that is actually useful to say, and that you've done it to the best you can when you're putting it out there into the world. And I think that's when you have something to say that comes from deep within your heart and can communicate to other people and their hearts, I think that's often when the best books happen, and when books resonate most widely with readers.
And I forgot to plug Lilo Tea Time, but we should do that. And if you would tell the esteemed audience where they can find you online, learn more about you, and find all your books, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So thanks to the pandemic, actually, we started doing these wonderful things called Tea Time Talks at Lee and Low, where editors of books would interview writers on Skype, or not on Skype, on Zoom. And we have a really nice library of these now with me and my colleagues talking to our various authors about their new projects. I did one earlier with Hina Khan, who you mentioned, and who did a picture book called Under My Hijab. And I did another one earlier this year. It was super fun with Sherry Thomas, who wrote a retelling of Mulan, a YA retelling of the Mulan legend, called The Magnolia Sword. And after the Disney movie came out, she and I watched the movie, and then we chatted about it as a tea time talk. And it was a super fun conversation. And all of those are online through the Lee and Low website. You can find them if you go to the books pages, or if you go to the Lee and Low blog and look for tea time talks. And for me personally, I have a website, CherylKlein.com, where I talk about both my editorial work and my picture books. I also have a newsletter, although I have not sent out a new newsletter edition in more than a year, which, guess what, almost exactly corresponds with the age of my child. But I should actually send out a new one, because I have A Year of Everyday Wonders coming out in December, and it would be useful to send out a new book, or a new newsletter. So I'm CherylKlein.com with a very occasional newsletter available there. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Chevelaque, which is CHAVELAQUE. And I am voluble on both.
It was a privilege and a pleasure. Esteemed audience, you know where to find me. I'm at middlegradeninja.com. Go there. You can read interviews with really cool authors, editors, publishing professionals. Get the back catalog. Download your free copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. And God willing, I'm alive. I'll see you next week.